Welcome to episode 2 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourscreenplay.com. In this episode, I'm going to give you a brief overview of how I got into the business and sold my first few screenplays. I think I'm probably like a lot of people who are listening to this podcast. I didn't grow up in LA and I didn't know anybody in the business when I first started out. Through trial and error, I slowly made headway and eventually sold a few scripts. Hopefully you can learn from my story and implement some of the things that have worked for me. So I got my first review in iTunes. I want to thank Byron Lee Marsh for doing a review and giving me 5 stars in iTunes. Thank you very much for that. If you listen to this through iTunes, please do log in and just leave me a review and a rating. I'm really trying to improve the podcast, and getting feedback like this really helps me do that. So again, thank you to Byron for leaving a nice review and giving me some stars. Thanks. A couple of quick notes. Any websites or links that I mentioned during the podcast will be in the show notes. I also will publish a transcript of this podcast in case you'd rather read it for whatever reason. You can find the podcast show notes at sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcasts. Also, if you want my free guide, How to Sell Your Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once a week for 5 weeks, along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell your screenplay in that guide, how to write a professional logline and query letter, how to find agents, managers, and producers who are looking for material. It really is everything you need to know to sell your screenplay. So each podcast episode, I just want to take a minute and explain a little bit what I'm working on. Hopefully you can learn something from this. I actually just finished up a spec screenplay, and I'm getting ready to do a blast for that screenplay. I'm always trying to figure out what producers are looking for. So I always scour the various online sources where producers are looking for screenplays. And whenever I get a rejection from a producer, I always follow it up with an email asking them what sort of material are they looking for. So I'm just trying to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of what producers are looking for and what kind of scripts they think they can get financed and get produced. One thing that I seem to be hearing quite often, since production costs have kind of come down, there seems to be this real need for low budget, one location screenplays. Buried and Phone Booth are 2 fairly recent examples of one location scripts. Hitchcock's Rear Window and Rope would be examples of one location scripts. And these films, if they're done right, they can be good, but they can also be done fairly cheaply. And, producers are always looking to create a product without having to spend a lot of money. So I've kind of just been thinking about what I could do for a one location screenplay. One of the films that I did a couple of years ago, we eventually found distribution, and it was a lot of trial and error trying to find distribution. I talked to a lot of distributors, and one thing that kept coming back from distributors was that sexy thrillers are always good films to have because they play well overseas. Comedies a little dicey overseas. Romantic comedies, again, just a little bit dicey overseas, but sexy thrillers can pretty much play throughout the world. And there's another sort of Hollywood truism, and that is that there are not enough good roles for women. So thinking about these 3 things, I set out to write a one-location sexy thriller that had a female protagonist. And that's basically what I have. And I've finished the script, and now I'm basically getting ready to blast it out. A lot of times you hear from other screenwriters and screenwriting gurus, they give you this advice to write what you're passionate about and not to worry about trends. And I mean, kind of what I just explained sounds like it might be contrary to that. I don't necessarily think it is. I mean, I personally like thrillers. I always enjoy watching them. I've written a bunch of thrillers over the years. So it's, it's within my wheelhouse. And really all I'm doing is taking a step back and focusing what I would normally write anyways, and trying to sort of fit what I'm going to normally write into some constraints. And I kind of think in some ways that's actually more creative, to give yourself constraints and then try and be creative within those constraints. So the constraints were, hey, can I come up with a sexy thriller idea that basically takes place in one location and then tell that story through the eyes of a female protagonist? So I still think you do have to write what you're passionate about and what interests you, but I also think at the same time you can kind of take a step back and try and focus what you're writing, and just keep an eye out towards what you're actually going to be, where you're actually going to sell the script, and what producers might be interested in the script. I'm actually doing a online class on September 21st, but the topic is actually choosing your concept, and the online class is actually called choosing a marketable concept. So I'll give you some more details later on in the podcast about that. But anyways, in the next few days, I'll be doing this blast. Hopefully all goes well. I'll report back and have some good news to report on the podcast. Anyways, wish me luck. So now let's just get into the main segment of this week's episode, which is about how I started out in the business and sold my first few screenplays. I'm sure there's many people out there who are just basically like me. I mean, when I went to college, I really had no idea what I wanted to do. Luckily, I was on the tennis team, and I met a couple of guys who were accounting majors, and they got jobs. They were seniors when I was a freshman, and they got jobs. They were going for interviews that spring semester, and they both got jobs. So for lack of any kind of a better idea, I decided to be an accounting major. By junior year, though, I knew I didn't want to be an accountant, and I still didn't really have any ideas about what I did want to do, and I didn't want to stay long and take extra time to graduate. So I just decided to suck it up and be an accounting major. One of the electives for accounting was called Economics of India, and for whatever reason, it was taught in this very obscure class in the library. And across the hall from the class was the poetry reading room. And one day I got there early to class, and the door was locked from the classroom, so I just wandered across the hall into the poetry reading room. And they had this book called Writer's Market, and it's put out by Writer's Digest, and it's actually still around to this day. And in that book, Writer's Market, they had a section on screenwriting, and they listed a bunch of production companies who would supposedly accept submissions from new writers. So this was pretty exciting to me. I kind of had always had it in the back of my mind that I thought it would be neat to be a screenwriter, but I just had no idea what to do. And so I was just never motivated to write because I had no idea what to do with the script if I actually did finish it. Keep in mind, this was, the early to mid 90s. So it was really before the internet. So there was no Googling anything or anything else. It's just, running into this writer's market was really a pretty unique thing. And as I said, it just inspired me. So basically, I decided they had a nice little section at the beginning of it that said how to write a query letter. They kind of described the steps, how to pitch your script in this query letter. So I wrote up 10 pages of screenplay that I thought were just hilarious. And I picked two companies who seemed especially open to accepting screenplays from new writers. And it said back then, it said to include a self-addressed stamped envelope or self-addressed stamped postcard. So I did that. I sent the query letters off. Again, this was to two companies. So one of the guys, he sent the postcard back, and it said, "Thank you for that undated, untitled submission." And he politely said, "No, thank you." Another guy, though, was just nice enough. I guess I had included my phone number, and he actually called me. And looking back on it, I have no idea why he called me. He just was a really nice guy, and he could tell that I had no idea what I was doing. So he just basically called me and gave me some advice. And the advice basically boiled down to go read Sid Field's screenplay. And if you haven't read it, I highly advise that you go and check it out. Again, I'll link to that in the show notes. But it's a really classic screenwriting book, and everybody should read it. It's still, even all these years later, it's still pretty good advice. So in any event, graduation was sort of moving up, and I ended up getting into a screenwriting class at another college. I went to a very small liberal arts college that didn't have screenwriting, but they had like some sort of a share program with a college across town, and they had a screenwriting class. So I took that screenwriting class, and I started to think, you know what, I'm going to just, I had absolutely nothing to do when I graduated, no job prospects. I didn't want to be an accountant. So I figured, you know what, I'll just, I'll move to LA when I graduate. And so I did. I graduated and moved, and the first job I got in LA was at a tennis club, just working at the front desk. answering the phone. And one of the other guys who did the same job I did, working the front desk, he was going to CSUN, which is California State University, Northridge. And he was getting his MA in film, and they had the same basic program with a screenwriting emphasis. So again, I was just kind of plodding along. This was within the first year of being here. I was writing scripts and stuff, but not really having any success. The state universities out here in California are really cheap. So I just went and enrolled, and I got into that class, or got into that program, again, working towards my master's degree in film with an emphasis in screenwriting. And the classes were not that great. I really don't think I learned much from the classes. By this time I had written a good number of scripts, and I had read, pretty much all the screenwriting books. So I was pretty much up on sort of the academic nature of screenwriting. But there's always these little things that give you value from the experience, even though it's not sort of part of the curriculum. And there was a guy in the classes with me. His name was Stan Williamson, and he had just written and optioned a script that he wrote called Just Right. And it stars Jeremy Piven, long before Entourage, and Sherilyn Fenn. And it was actually a pretty good little movie. And it ended up, he optioned it when he was in this class, and they ended up producing it, and it turned out pretty well. And again, it's just one of these chance meetings, but one day we were walking out of class, and I just asked him, I said, how did you option it? How did you sell it? And he basically told me, he said he had submitted it to an ad in the back of the trades. And again, this was, the mid to late 90s by this time. And so like Hollywood Reporter, Daily Variety, in the back of those trades, they would have classified sections. I'm sure they still do. But they would have classified sections, and producers would occasionally post ads saying they were looking for a screenplay. They would give some criteria, maybe a comedy or thriller or whatever, and you would see it, and they would have their mailing address, and you would just send them a hard copy of the script. And so he said he did that. Really, he was very he would consistently submit to these things, and I had done a little bit. I had seen the ads, and I had submitted a few, but I had never gotten any response whatsoever, not any no's, nothing, just zilch. So I just kind of stopped submitting. But he said over the years, he had optioned numerous scripts this way, and he had earned, he claimed he had earned $10,000 to $15,000 optioning scripts over the years. And so hearing that, it was, again, I'm just eternally grateful that he was willing to share this with me. And I got really motivated, and I just started really submitting to those ads religiously. I would make a real effort every week to go down, look through the trades, and send in my scripts. And I had a bunch of different scripts in different genres by this time, so I could cover just about every ad. Just one quick side note. I don't think these ads still exist in the trades. I think for the most part, these types of ads have moved online to various sites. Even stuff like Craigslist, I will occasionally still submit to ads there, but those are the kinds of ads that you would see, the kind of stuff you would see on like Inktip or Craigslist today. Those are the types of ads you would see in these trades. So in any event, again, this is probably the late 90s, and I'm just religiously submitting to all of these ads that I can find. At first I would send in stuff, and I didn't get a lot of results quickly, but I started to get a few sort of minor results. I'd get an occasional phone call. I'd send in a script, or sometimes they'd just say, send us log line. So I might send a query letter with a log line, and the producer would call me, and I would talk to them. I started to realize that these people were real, and they were making movies. One producer read one of my scripts and called me in. I actually met with him, and he was a real low budget producer, but he wanted to hire me to write an idea. He had a treatment. He wanted me to write it up for him, and he ended up going with another writer. But again, it was like a first meeting. I got in there, and I could see that if I submitted long enough and consistently enough, that these would actually start to pay off. And so, again, I just persevered, and eventually I did start to show some consistent results. The first screenplay that I ever optioned and sold was a movie called Dish Dogs, and that's literally, I saw an ad in the back of one of the trades, Variety or Hollywood Reporter, sent them the screenplay, they liked it, and they eventually made it. I optioned a film noir thriller screenplay and made a few $1,000s just for the option, and it was all around the same time, and they actually did not end up producing the movie. But again, it was a legitimate option with a legitimate production company. I also met a writer, a pretty well established writer, and he was setting up a writers group basically to write up his ideas, and he was paying us basically by the hour to come in, and he would come up with some ideas, and then we would write the scripts. And I also actually, another one of my credits is a film called Reunion, and that was another one of these cold query letters where I met a director who was doing really low budget features, and so the bottom line was, after a couple of years of really consistently submitting, I started to see some pretty concrete results. Now, I don't want to gloss over the sheer volume and consistency of the query letters that I was sending out. As I said, this was probably a span of about 3 years. I was working a regular job at the time, 40 hours a week, so it's not like I had all the time in the world to go do this, but I would make an effort once a week to go down to the library, and I would flip through these different trade magazines. And I mean, literally in this 3 or 4 or 5 year period, probably a 5 year period, because I actually I continued to submit even after I started selling stuff. It probably took me 2 or 3 years before I really sold something this way, and then for probably a 5 year period, I bet I did not miss more than a week or two in this 5 year period of going down to the library and sending these things in. So it was not simple, and it was not easy. I mean, I had to really put forth the effort, and this is really important because I really believe that a lot of the success I've had has been because I'm just so consistent and persistent with my marketing. So in any event, once Dish Dogs and Reunion were finished, I mean, I sold the scripts, they got produced, and I made a real effort to find an agent, and I made an effort to start approaching other production companies, but it unfortunately became very clear very quickly that despite having these credits, they were not really my big breaks, and they weren't really going to it just really wasn't. It wasn't going to just catapult me to an A-list screenwriter. Unfortunately, I was earning I was earning my living by this point as a screenwriter. I mean, as I said, I had this sort of job writing up this writer's ideas, and I was optioning and selling some stuff. But there's just sort of this idea. A lot of new writers think that once they sell a script, get that first script under their belt, that it's all smooth sailing from there. And, I'm here to tell you that unfortunately that's not the case. So, it didn't happen. It didn't happen for me. I mean, I sent letters to agents, and I ended up actually getting kind of a crappy agent. But I was not able to get a good agent. Perhaps I'm not a great networker either. I'm not really particularly outgoing or social, so maybe there's opportunities that I missed. But I think in some ways it's a little bit of a myth. I think, unless you really sell a big studio film, or even if you sell an independent film, it's got to do well. It's got to kind of get on the radar for you to really hit that A level. And Dish Dogs did not do that. So, there I was. I mean, at this point, I didn't have a job other than screenwriting. So I kind of realized that I needed to really expand my marketing efforts and basically keep doing what I had been doing to get me to that point. So that's what I really did. I just kept sending them out. I kept figuring out, better ways. I mean, again, I met with a producer once, and she actually said, send faxes. We don't get that many fax query letters, and those would probably work. So I tried that. And, by this time we're probably talking, early to mid 2000s. But I just started building a large list of agents, managers, and production companies. I mean, just everywhere on the internet that you could find them, find this sorts of information, I would just put into my database and start doing these massive email and fax blasts. And really, to this day, that's kind of the basis of my strategy. I continue to this day to write spec scripts and send them out. Earlier in the podcast, I kind of mentioned my approach to writing a marketable screenplay. I mean, that's definitely part of it. Before you start writing, really think about where you're going to send it. And that's basically what I do. I try and write a good marketable screenplay, write a good logline, write a good query letter, just submit it far and wide to my database, and hopefully I option and sell the screenplay. One thing I'd like to point out too is, I didn't say write a great script. I think there's this idea of, write a great script and it will get noticed, and it's a bit of a myth. You don't need a great script to make my strategy work. You need a good script. You need something that's, halfway decent. But if you really do have a great script, you'll just blow the wheels off this strategy because, some of the scripts that I've optioned have definitely not been great. So in any event, as I said, I mean, this is basically just now I've got this sort of strategy down, and it's basically just rinse and repeat. And you can check out, that's probably worth doing if you haven't done it. Go to IMDb and just type in my name, Ashley Scott Myers, and just have a look at my credits. Because as I said, with the exception of one credit that with the exception of my most recent credit, all of my credits have come through basically this cold query letters, just sending out query letters, pitches, and optioning scripts, and then hopefully the screenplay gets made. So, if you just want to kind of see how effective this strategy is, I would say the proof is in the pudding. So, if you haven't done it, check out my credits. The one credit that I do have is actually a movie that's currently in post-production called Ninja Apocalypse. It's a low-budget martial arts film. And that one actually did kind of come about, I wouldn't say networking, and in some ways it was a cold query letter. It's the director actually of the film brought me onto it, and he was a fan of a script that I wrote a few years ago. It's kind of a long story. I'll spare you the details, but it wasn't really a direct result of a cold query letter. But other than that, all my credits are literally a direct result of a query letter. If you want to learn more about the nuts and bolts of what I just explained in terms of launching a email and fax blast campaign, I would encourage you to check out my free guide, Selling Your Screenplay in 5 Weeks. I go through all the specifics about exactly how to do this, and it's all based on my experience, which is kind of what I just described. So if you want to just get really into the nuts and bolts and try and launch your own campaign, check out my guide. It's at sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. Again, it's free. You just put in your email address, and I'll send you the 5 lessons, which basically goes through all the steps that you'll need to take to successfully have a email and fax blast campaign. Hopefully, now that I've explained my strategy, you'll kind of see that it can work for anybody as long as you're willing to do the work. I mean, growing up, I really had no role models. I grew up in a small town, Annapolis, Maryland, and there were certainly no filmmakers in Annapolis, and there really were no artists to speak of. Really, there was no role models in terms of trying to be a screenwriter. I thought it would be a neat thing to do, but I really didn't think it was possible. I was a mediocre student in school. I certainly showed no particular aptitude for creative writing or really anything in school. I was pretty much bad at everything. When I moved to LA, I didn't know anybody in the business. In fact, I didn't even know anybody in LA. So if this can work for me, it can really work for anybody, including yourself. It's not simple and it's not easy. But if you're willing to do the work, I do think that it can work for you. Nothing that I did really required a lot of luck. It was just a matter of working hard and being persistent. Again, I don't want to make it seem like it was easy, because it was a ton of work, but the bottom line is it can work. it's possible. It is possible. If you're willing to devote the time and the effort to becoming a good screenwriter, it's possible. If nothing else, from today's podcast, hopefully you can at least come away with that feeling that it's possible. For me, again, growing up, I really didn't think it was possible. I just really had no role models. So that was really a big hurdle, I would say, for me, especially to kind of get started. Since I really didn't think it was possible, there wasn't a lot of motivation to really start writing and just start learning, because it just didn't seem possible. But after I found that writer's market, I started to think maybe this is possible. And after I sent out those first 10 pages and that guy called me, all of a sudden I started thinking maybe this is possible. I'm just eternally thankful to that guy who called me, whether he knows it or not. I mean, he essentially launched my screenwriting career. Looking back at it now, it's very non-typical for someone in Hollywood to do that, to get some terrible pages and to actually take time out of their busy day and call. So I have no idea why he did it. And believe me, it wasn't because he saw potential in my pages, because he didn't. My pages were terrible. I knew nothing about screenwriting. It wasn't formatted. It was it was nothing. I had never even seen a screenplay. So I literally just, opened up a Word document and started typing and sent those pages to him. So, and if nothing else though, by him calling me, it really made it seem like this was possible. Same thing at CSUN, when I asked Stan how he sold his screenplay, and he told me, he could have been vague and not wanted to share that information, because really, by him telling me, it just meant there was more competition. I mean, I was going to be submitting to the same ads that he was submitting to. And so it, in some ways, probably lessened his chances of actually optioning and selling stuff. But, he told me, and I got to see firsthand that this guy sold a script. He's a nice guy, and he sold a script. And again, it just was a real, sort of a moment where I started to think that this was really possible. So that's really how I kind of want to conclude the main segment. Is if nothing else, hopefully hopefully you've gotten some ideas about a real actionable plan about how you can go out and market your screenplay. But at the very least, hopefully you've kind of heard my story and can relate to it and realize that I'm not super smart or anything else, or some great creative genius with all kinds of writing ability. I'm just a guy who went out there and persisted, and now I've sold a bunch of scripts. So it's possible, and I really think if you put the work in, you can do it too. I just want to take a moment and plug my upcoming online class. It's going to be on September 21st at 10 a.m. That's a Saturday. And the topic of the class is choosing a marketable concept, how to avoid the single biggest mistake made by new screenwriters. This really is, I've been running my blog now for quite a while, and one of the services I offer on the blog is helping people write their logline and query letter. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is people, especially newer writers, they choose concepts that are totally unmarketable. So I thought that an online class trying to help people get past that would be very helpful. So if you want to learn more about that, just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/classes. And you can learn more about it. All the particulars are on that. But again, that's September 21st at 10 a.m. and that's a Saturday. This class is part of my Selling Your Screenplay program. I offer a whole bunch of benefits to members, including these classes, plus a monthly conference call where you can ask me any screenwriting related questions. I also have a forum where you can ask me questions, and I'll actually review your logline and query letter. And also, if you're a member, you have access to my my database, and you can actually purchase an email and fax blast, and that will go out to all the same people that I'm sending my own query letters to. So if you want to learn more about those services, just go to sellingyourscreenplayselect.com. Again, that's sellingyourscreenplayselect.com. I'm planning on releasing a new episode about once a month. Hopefully I'll be able to increase that as I get better at actually producing these podcasts, but just look for a new episode on the first Monday of each month. In next month's episode, I'm going to be talking to script doctor Eric. He's worked as a script analyst. He's also read scripts for agents, and he actually has a produced credit as well. So he can offer us some great firsthand knowledge about the whole screenwriting process. So I just want to end this podcast with the writing words section. You know, in the mid-2000s, when poker became popular, I kind of, like a lot of other people, got into, playing online poker and going to the casinos and reading poker books. And there was a story in one of the poker books that I remember and look back on. I think it was a book by Barry Greenstein called Ace on the River, but I'm not entirely sure. I think that was the book. In any event, the story went something like this. There were two sports gamblers who were betting against each other. And one of the guys started losing a lot. So one day he put a huge bet on a long shot. And the guy who took the bet ended up telling one of his friends that if he lost, he wouldn't be able to pay the bet. The long shot was just too great. And if the other guy won, he didn't have the money to cover the bet. So luckily for the guy, the long shot did not win, and he didn't have to pay him. But the point in the book was, you don't want to be in a position like this where you're risking something but have really no chance of winning something. And I'll even take that a step further. You want to be in the opposite situation. You want to be in the situation where the guy was who took the bet, because he wasn't going to pay. He got some money, and if he lost, he simply wasn't going to pay. So he had really no downside. He had a good bit of upside, but no downside. And this is kind of how I view life. We get 80 years or so, and we kind of can do whatever we want. And there's really no downside to doing what we want. And it's not to say there's no consequences. I mean, if that guy who took the bet, if he had lost and not paid, I mean, he would have had to move to another town or risk, getting his legs broken. So there are consequences. But the bottom line is, if you want to be a screenwriter, there's no downside to trying. Think about, sitting on the couch all weekend and watching sports, or sitting on the couch and watching Entertainment Tonight, or any number of other shows. I mean, what's really the upside? There's really very little upside. Perhaps, some fun, relaxation, but the downside is your arteries are going to clog and you're going to die. So there's not a lot of upside, but not a lot of downside. But think about this. If you sit down and start writing, if you've never written a script, and you're listening to this podcast, clearly you want to be a screenwriter. So, there's no downside to sitting down and actually writing. You lose a little bit of time, but the potential upside is huge. You can launch a screenwriting career. Even if that doesn't happen, though, just seeing your script get made into a movie, even a low-budget movie, even if you write a short, there's just very little downside to being a screenwriter and writing a script, and that's the greatest thing, and hopefully it's liberating. If you've written a few scripts, I would urge you to take a step back and ask yourself, what's really the downside to moving to Los Angeles? If you're serious about being a screenwriter, there's a ton of upside. I mean, your chances are exponentially better of breaking into the industry if you live in LA than if you don't. And what's really the downside? Any sort of a career or job you could probably get in Los Angeles. You could have the same sort of life you have where you currently live. And it's a complicated thing. So I'm not just telling everybody that it makes sense for everybody, but I would just urge you to really look at the situations that you have and think about the upside and the downside, and try and find situations where there's a ton of upside and not a lot of downside. So that's it for this week's episode. I hope you'd enjoyed it. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.